The sun pressed heavy upon the Montana plains, its light spilling gold across dust and scrub. Three men on horseback approached the weathered cabin, kicking up clouds of fine dirt that hung in the still afternoon air. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards from the porch. Mason Holloway stood motionless on his cabin steps, Winchester rifle held steady in weathered hands. His face, etched with lines from years under the harsh prairie sun, betrayed no emotion. Only his eyes, sharp and clear as a winter sky, revealed his resolve. "Only an old man and two children," Victor Caldwell called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge that sliced through the silence. "Step aside, Holloway. This doesn't concern you." Mason didn't blink. "Take one more step toward this house, and I'll send you straight to hell." The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. From inside the cabin came the frightened cry of a child. Victor's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a sneer as he exchanged glances with his companions. "You're making a mistake, old man," he said, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. Mason's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger. "Maybe," he replied, his voice low and steady as stone, "but it'll be the last one you see." The merciless Montana sun beat down on Mason's back as he worked the fence line. Sweat trickled between his shoulder blades, soaking the faded blue shirt that had once been his Sunday best. His hands, calloused from years of labor, moved with practiced efficiency, tightening loose wire and replacing rotted posts. The rhythm of the work kept his mind occupied, kept the memories at bay. Most days. Today they pressed in despite his efforts. Today would have been Margaret's 47th birthday. Mason paused, straightening his aching back, and gazed across the rolling expanse of his modest ranch. The drought had turned what should have been verdant pasture into a sea of brittle yellow. In the distance, a small herd of cattle huddled in the meager shade of a cottonwood grove. They were thin, but alive, like him. He pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest. The timepiece had traveled from Scotland, with his grandfather passed to his father, and finally to him on his wedding day. Mason clicked it open, his thumb instinctively finding the hidden catch that revealed not the watch face, but a small daguerreotype of a woman and boy. Margaret's eyes stared back at him, frozen in time, still filled with the quiet joy that had sustained him through 20 years of marriage. Beside her, his son David, forever 10 years old, with Mason's own determined chin and his mother's gentle eyes. "Tomorrow's her birthday, Margaret," he whispered to the empty air. 7 years now. The cicadas droned in the distance, their song weaving through the hush of noon, offering no response but their endless, rhythmic chorus. Mason snapped the watch closed and returned it to his pocket. Grief was a luxury afforded in moments, not days. There was work to be done. He had just driven another post into the unyielding ground when he heard it, a sound so unexpected that at first he thought he'd imagined it. A knock at his door. Soft, hesitant, as if the person feared the door might splinter beneath their hand. Then it came again, more insistent. Mason squinted toward his cabin. No wagon or horse in sight. Strange. He gathered his tools, placing them in the wheelbarrow with deliberate care, then made his way back. His boots kicked up dust that clung to his sweat-dampened trousers. The knocking had stopped, but Mason could sense someone waiting. As he rounded the corner of the cabin, he saw her. A young woman stood at his door, her body swaying slightly as if it took all her remaining strength to remain upright. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of a winter sky and hung loose on her frame. Her dark hair had been pinned back, but strands had escaped, clinging to her sweat-dampened face and neck. It was her eyes that struck him most. Large, dark, and holding a desperate courage that seemed ready to shatter at any moment. She was not alone. A small girl of about 7 clung to her skirts, watching Mason with wary curiosity. Behind them, a smaller child, a boy no more than 5, sat slumped against the porch railing, his face hidden in the crook of his arm. "Ma'am," Mason said, setting down his tools and removing his hat. "Can I help you?" The woman straightened, gathering her dignity like a cloak around her thin shoulders. "I'm sorry to trouble you, sir," she said, her voice hoarse but cultured. "We've been walking since dawn." Mason noticed her cracked lips, the way she kept one hand on the porch post to steady herself. The children's faces were pale, their eyes too large. "Where are you headed?" he asked, moving closer, concern overriding his usual reserve. "Anywhere," she whispered, then seemed to regret the admission. She swallowed, composing herself. I mean Pine Ridge. We're hoping to find work there. Mason knew she was lying. Pine Ridge was a 2-day walk in the opposite direction from where she'd come. You're a fair piece off course, he said gently. Something flickered in her eyes, fear perhaps, or resignation. Then she lifted her chin and opened her palm. Resting there was a thin gold band, dulled by years of wear. Would you buy my ring? She asked, her voice breaking on the last word. My children haven't eaten in 4 days. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with desperation and shame. The little girl pressed closer to her mother, while the boy remained motionless, too exhausted even to look up. Mason felt a tightening in his chest. He glanced at the boy's small form, and for a heartbeat saw David sitting there, instead hungry and lost. The ghost of his son, superimposed on this strange child, nearly stole his breath. What's your name? He asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Rebecca, she answered. Rebecca Caldwell. These are my children, Lily and Samuel. Mason nodded, his eyes moving from the ring to the children and back to Rebecca's face. He didn't reach for the offered ring. Instead, he turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the door open behind him. For a moment, Rebecca's face stiffened, her lips parting in fresh fear. She clutched the ring tighter, as if afraid he might take it without offering anything in return. Inside, Mason moved with purpose. He took bread from the tin, sliced it thick, added generous portions of cold venison from his morning hunt. He poured milk from the morning's milking into a pitcher, grabbed cups, and returned to the porch. Sit, he said, simply indicating the rough-hewn bench against the cabin wall. He set the food and milk on the small table he used for cleaning game. Rebecca hesitated, her hand with the ring still extended. Keep your ring, Mason said, his voice gruff but not unkind. No man should profit from a mother's desperation. Her hand trembled as she closed her fingers around the ring, relief and wariness battling in her expression. Thank you, she whispered, the words barely audible. The children needed no urging. Lily reached for the bread first, but paused, looking to her mother for permission. Rebecca nodded, and the girl took a piece, breaking it carefully in half to share with her brother. Samuel reached for it with both hands, cramming it into his mouth as if afraid it might disappear. Slowly, Rebecca cautioned, her voice gentle despite her evident hunger. You'll make yourself sick, Samuel. But the warning came too late. After a few desperate bites and gulps of milk, the boy doubled over, retching onto the porch boards. Rebecca moved to him instantly, her face flushing with embarrassment. I'm so sorry, she said, looking up at Mason with mortification. Mason shook his head. No need, he said, disappearing inside again. He returned with a wine and a bucket of water, cleaning the mess himself, despite Rebecca's protests. Happens when you've gone too long without, he explained matter-of-factly. Try again, but smaller bites. Sips, not gulps. Under his guidance, the children managed to keep down small portions. Rebecca ate last, taking the smallest share, despite Mason's insistence that there was plenty. As they ate, Mason studied them from his position, leaning against the porch rail. Rebecca's clothes, though travel-stained and worn, had once been fine. Her speech and manners suggested education. Not a woman accustomed to begging, which made her current state all the more concerning. The children, too, showed signs of recent neglect rather than lifelong poverty. Their hair had been neatly trimmed not long ago, and though their clothes were dusty, they were well made. Where have you come from, Mrs. Caldwell? Mason asked when their immediate hunger had been satisfied. Rebecca tensed her hand, moving protectively to Lily's shoulder. Silver Creek, she said after a pause. My husband passed on last winter. Influenza. Mason nodded, not commenting on her hesitation. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Her reply was automatic, hollow. The sun was sinking toward the western hills, painting the landscape in amber light. Mason considered his options. The nearest town was Pine Ridge, a good 10 miles away. Too far for them to reach before nightfall, especially in their weakened state. It'll be dark soon, he said. You can stay in my barn for the night. It's clean and there's fresh hay. Relief flooded Rebecca's face, followed quickly by wariness. We couldn't impose. It's no imposition, Mason cut in. I don't offer what I don't mean to give. Rebecca studied him as if trying to discern his true intentions. Mason met her gaze steadily, his weathered face revealing nothing but calm certainty. Why would you help strangers? She asked finally, the question so direct it surprised him. Mason considered this. Because I can, he answered simply. Then seeing her continued hesitation, he added, I've got a spare bedroll and blankets. You'll be safe there, and you can be on your way at first light if you choose." Something in his tone must have reassured her, for she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," he supplied, Mason Holloway. As he led them to the barn, Mason noted how Rebecca kept herself between him and her children, how her eyes constantly assessed their surroundings looking for threats. The instincts of a woman who had learned the hard way that the world was not safe. The barn was indeed clean, the hay fresh. Mason brought the promised bedroll and blankets along with a lantern and a small pail of water for washing. He showed them where the outhouse was located, then prepared to leave them for the night. "Mr. Holloway," Rebecca called as he reached the door. He turned back. She stood in the lantern light, her children already settling into the makeshift bed, her face a complex map of emotions. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," he replied. "Get some rest, Mrs. Caldwell. Things often look different in the morning light." He closed the barn door behind him, leaving them to their privacy. As he walked back to his cabin through the gathering dusk, Mason felt a strange disturbance in the rhythm of his solitary life. For 7 years he had lived alone, speaking more to his livestock than to other humans. He'd grown accustomed to the silence, to days measured only by the rising and setting of the sun, to the absence of laughter or tears, or any sound but those made by nature and his own labor. Now, with 3 strangers asleep in his barn, that carefully constructed solitude had been breached. He should have felt irritation, or at the very least impatience, for their departure. Instead, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a restlessness, a shift in the atmosphere, as if a storm was approaching from beyond the horizon. Inside his cabin, Mason moved through his evening routine by habit. He cleaned his rifle, checked his supplies, recorded the day's work in his ledger. But his thoughts kept returning to the woman and her children. What had driven them to such desperation? Silver Creek was over 30 miles east. Had they truly walked all that way? And why was Rebecca Caldwell so afraid? Mason sat by the window, the lamp turned low, and stared out toward the barn. The silver pocket watch lay open in his palm, Margaret and David's faces barely visible in the dim light. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to remember not just their deaths, but their lives. The sound of Margaret's laughter, the way David would run to meet him when he returned from town. "What would you have done, Margaret?" he whispered to the photograph. "You always knew the right thing." The silence of the cabin offered no answer, but Mason knew anyway. Margaret would have brought them into the house, made up beds, cooked a proper meal. She would have sat with Rebecca woman to woman and gently uncovered her story. Mason wasn't Margaret. He didn't have her easy way with people, her natural warmth, but he could offer practical help at least. With sudden decision, Mason rose and moved quietly to the storage chest at the foot of his bed. From it, he took extra blankets, a small loaf of bread he'd baked the day before, and a jar of preserves Margaret had put up in that last summer. He'd been saving them, though, for what he couldn't have said. He slipped out into the night and approached the barn. No light showed beneath the door. They had extinguished the lantern. Moving as silently as his bulk would allow, Mason placed the items just outside the barn door where Rebecca would find them in the morning. As he straightened, a sound from within the barn froze him in place. A child's whimper quickly hushed. Then Rebecca's voice, so low he could barely make out the words. "Shh, Samuel, we're safe here. Sleep now." The boy whimpered again. "I want Papa." "I know, love," Rebecca whispered, her voice catching. "I know." Mason backed away, feeling like an intruder on their grief. He returned to his cabin and finally sought his own bed, but sleep was long in coming. Morning brought a clarity to the Montana sky that always reminded Mason of Margaret's eyes. He rose with the sun, as was his habit, and set about his morning chores. He milked the cow, fed the chickens, and was chopping wood when he heard the barn door open. Rebecca emerged looking somewhat restored by a night's rest. Her hair had been neatly braided, her face washed clean. She had found his offerings, for she carried the blankets folded over one arm. Her eyes sought him out immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," she called, walking toward him. The children followed Lily, curious and alert, Samuel dragging his feet, eyes on the ground. "Mrs. Caldwell," Mason acknowledged, setting down his axe. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted. "Thank you for the extra blankets and the bread." Mason nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Coffee's on if you'd like some." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly at the invitation to enter his home, but she accepted with a nod. "That's very kind. Perhaps I could help with breakfast. It's the least I can do. Mason considered refusing, but something told him she needed to repay his kindness, if only to preserve her dignity. If you've a mind to, he agreed. Inside the cabin, Rebecca moved with quiet efficiency, finding plates and utensils, helping to prepare a simple meal of eggs and the remaining bread. Lily sat at the table watching them both with solemn eyes, while Samuel huddled in a corner, still withdrawn. Your son doesn't speak much, Mason observed as they sat down to eat. A shadow crossed Rebecca's face. He hasn't spoken more than a few words since... She paused, her eyes darting to the children. Since his father died. Mason nodded, understanding her reluctance to discuss such matters in front of her children. He didn't press further, and they ate in companionable silence. After the meal, Rebecca insisted on washing the dishes, and Mason led her, turning his attention to planning his day's work. We should be on our way soon, Rebecca said as she dried the last plate. We've imposed on your kindness long enough. Mason glanced outside. The sun promised another scorching day. You're welcome to rest here another day, he offered. Get your strength back before continuing on. Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn. That's very generous, but I need to ride into town for supplies. Mason continued as if she hadn't spoken. I could bring back more food, maybe some proper shoes for the children. He'd noticed their footwear was worn nearly through. I can't accept charity, Rebecca said, her spine straightening. Not charity, Mason corrected. You can help around the place. I've let some things go. That much was true. Since Margaret's death, he'd maintained only what was necessary for survival. The vegetable garden she'd loved was now just a patch of earth. The curtains at the windows had faded from washing and sun. The cabin was clean, but Spartan, devoid of the small touches that had once made it a home. Rebecca followed his gaze around the cabin and seemed to understand. I could certainly help with that, she agreed, but only for a day or two. Then we really must continue on. Mason nodded, satisfied. I'll head to town now then. Should be back by midday. As he saddled his horse, Mason pondered his own actions. Why was he so intent on keeping them here? Perhaps it was simply that they needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. Perhaps it was the memory of Margaret, who had never turned away anyone in need. Or perhaps a small voice whispered it was the silence of the cabin that had finally become too much to bear. Whatever the reason, Mason found himself looking forward to his return in a way he hadn't experienced in years. As he rode toward Pinridge, the morning sun at his back, he allowed himself to acknowledge a simple truth. For the first time since burying his family, he was not alone. Pine Ridge was little more than a wide spot in the road, a single street lined with essential businesses serving the surrounding ranches and farms. Mason tied his horse outside the general store and entered, nodding to Martha Sullivan, the proprietor. Martha, a widow of some 15 years, ran the store with brisk efficiency and knew every family within 20 miles. Mason Holloway, she greeted him, genuine warmth in her voice. Twice in 1 month, the world must be ending. Mason's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. Need supplies. Don't you always, Martha replied, already moving to gather his usual order. Flour, coffee, salt, pork. More than usual, Mason interrupted. And some other things. Martha raised an eyebrow but asked no questions as Mason added children's shoes, fabric, and extra food items to his list. She was just wrapping his purchases when the bell above the door jangled, announcing another customer. Sheriff Nathan Blackwood entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. At 60, Nathan was still imposing, his silver hair and weathered face giving him an air of authority that had nothing to do with the badge on his chest. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he spotted Mason. Well, look what the cat dragged in, he drawled, crossing to clap Mason on the shoulder. Thought you'd taken root out there on that ranch of yours. Mason acknowledged the familiar greeting ritual, a comfort despite himself. The two men had served together in the Union Army during the war, Nathan as a captain, Mason as a scout. They'd saved each other's lives more than once, forging a bond that had outlasted the conflict in the years that followed. Nathan was perhaps the only person in the county who could claim to be Mason's friend. What brings you to civilization? Nathan asked, leaning against the counter. Supplies, Mason answered simply. Nathan's eyes took in the pile of goods lingering on the small shoes. Must be expecting a growth spurt, he remarked casually. Mason met his gaze steadily. Got visitors, a woman and 2 young ones, came to my place yesterday half-starved. Nathan's expression shifted, concern replacing amusement. That's so. Where from? Claims Silver Creek. Husband died last winter. Martha, who had been pretending not to listen, abandoned the pretense. What's her name? She asked. Rebecca Caldwell, Mason replied, noting how both Martha and Nathan exchanged glances. You know of her? Martha shook her head, but Nathan's expression had grown guarded. Can't say as I do, he said, but something in his tone made Mason suspicious. She planning to stay long, just until they're strong enough to travel from, Mason said. Why be? Nathan shrugged too casually. No reason, just curious why they'd end up at your place so far from the main road. Before Mason could respond, the door opened again, admitting Reverend Franklin Woods. The minister was a thin man with an aquiline nose and perpetually disapproving eyes. He nodded curtly to the room at large. Sheriff, Mrs. Sullivan. His gaze landed on Mason. Mr. Holloway, a rare pleasure. Mason returned the nod but said nothing. He'd never warmed to Woods, whose sermons tended toward fire and brimstone rather than compassion. Margaret had attended church regularly. Mason had not set foot in the building since her funeral. I was just telling Nathan about Mason's visitors, Martha said, earning her a sharp look from Mason. A widow and her children from Silver Creek. Woods' eyebrows rose. Indeed, how charitable of you, Mr. Holloway, though perhaps not entirely proper. Mason felt a flash of irritation. Proper would have been letting them starve. Woods raised his hands placatingly. Of course not, but a single man taking in a widow, well, it invites talk. Let people talk, Mason said flatly. Makes no difference to me. But even as he spoke, Mason felt a stirring of concern. Not for himself, he'd long ago stopped caring what the town thought of him, but for Rebecca. A woman alone was vulnerable not just to physical threats, but to the destruction of her reputation. And in a small community like this, reputation could mean the difference between acceptance and ostracism. I'm sure Mr. Holloway's intentions are entirely honorable, Martha interjected, shooting Woods a quelling look. And I, for one, am glad to hear of someone showing Christian charity in deed rather than just word. Woods flushed slightly at the implied criticism. Naturally, I merely suggest that perhaps the church would be a more appropriate place for the poor woman to seek assistance. She didn't seek it, Mason said. She offered to sell her wedding ring to feed her children. A momentary silence fell over the store as his words sank in. Even Woods looked momentarily abashed. Well, Martha said briskly, breaking the tension, I think it's a fine thing you're doing, Mason. And if there's anything else they need, you just let me know. Mason nodded his thanks, paid for his purchases, and turned to leave. Nathan followed him outside. Mason, he said, his voice low. A word. Mason secured his packages to his saddle before turning to face his old friend. What is it? Nathan glanced around, ensuring they were alone. Be careful, he said, and there have been rumors from Silver Creek. What kind of rumors? Nothing specific, Nathan hedged. Just keep your eyes open. And if you notice anything unusual, let me know. Mason studied him, trying to read between the lines. You think she's in some kind of trouble? I didn't say that, Nathan replied. Just be careful, for your own sake. With that cryptic warning, Nathan tipped his hat and walked back toward his office, leaving Mason with more questions than answers. He mounted his horse and turned toward home, his thoughts troubled. What wasn't Nathan telling him? And what was Rebecca Caldwell running from? The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, the sun climbing higher, beating down on Mason's shoulders. By the time his cabin came into view, sweat had soaked through his shirt and dust coated his throat. But the sight that greeted him brought him up short. Rebecca was at the water pump filling a bucket. Her back was to him, and she had rolled up her sleeves against the heat. As she bent to lift the heavy bucket, her dress pulled tight across her shoulders, revealing dark bruises mottling her skin from neck to shoulder blade. Mason drew his horse to a halt, shock and anger washing through him in equal measure. Those weren't the marks of illness or accident. Someone had hurt her deliberately and brutally. Rebecca turned, sensing his presence, and her eyes widened in alarm. She quickly set down the bucket and tugged at her sleeves, but it was too late. Mason had seen. He dismounted slowly, giving her time to compose herself. When he approached leading his horse, Rebecca's face was a careful mask, but her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Mr. Holloway, she greeted him, her voice deliberately light. I hope you had a successful trip. Mason nodded, deciding not to confront her immediately. Got what we needed, he said, gesturing to his laden saddle. Where are the children? In the shade behind the cabin, Rebecca replied. Lily found an old checker set and is teaching Samuel to play. Mason was surprised. He hadn't seen that set in years. Margaret had bought it for David's 8th birthday. I hope that's all right, Rebecca added, noting his expression. I can tell them to put it away. No, Mason said quickly. It's good it's being used again. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the unspoken knowledge of what Mason had seen hanging between them. Finally, Mason spoke. Mrs. Caldwell, he began, his voice gentle despite its natural gruffness. I don't mean to pry, but those marks on your back. I fell, Rebecca interrupted, the lie brittle on her lips. On the journey here, it's nothing. Mason met her gaze steadily. No one falls onto a fist, Mrs. Caldwell. Rebecca paled, her composure cracking for an instant before she gathered it around her again. Please, she whispered, not in front of the children. Mason nodded his understanding. Later then, but I need to know what I'm dealing with here. Why, Rebecca asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Why would you involve yourself in our troubles? It was a fair question when Mason wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why was he involving himself? He'd lived 7 years in carefully constructed isolation, nursing his grief like a wound he couldn't allow to heal. What was it about this woman and her children that had breached his defenses? Because no one deserves to be treated that way, he said finally, and because I can help. Rebecca studied him, searching for deception or ulterior motives. Finding none, she nodded slowly. Tonight, she agreed, after the children are asleep. That evening, after a simple supper that Rebecca had prepared from Mason's supplies, they settled the children in the barn once more. Lily had chattered happily throughout the meal, clearly energized by a day of rest and proper food. Samuel remained silent, but Mason noticed he stayed closer to his mother, occasionally reaching up to touch her hand, as if reassuring himself of her presence. When Rebecca returned to the cabin, Mason was waiting on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. He'd poured 2 cups of kadivi and set them on the small table. Rebecca took the offered seat with a murmured thanks. For a long moment they sat in silence, the nocturnal sounds of the prairie crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft nickering of Mason's horse in the corral filling the space between them. My husband didn't die of influenza, Rebecca said finally, her voice so soft Mason had to lean forward to hear. That was a lie. Mason nodded, having suspected as much. What happened to him? Rebecca's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Charles, my husband, had a brother, Victor. They inherited their father's ranch jointly, but Victor always resented sharing what he considered his birthright. She took a deep breath. 6 months ago, Charles was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. They said his horse spooked, that it was an accident. But you don't believe that, Mason stated rather than asked. Rebecca's eyes, when they met his, were filled with a mixture of grief and cold fury. I know it wasn't. Charles was an excellent rider, and he knew that trail like the back of his hand. And the night before, he and Victor had argued violently about selling part of the ranch. Did you tell the sheriff? Of course, Rebecca said bitterly, but there was no proof. And Victor, he's respected in Silver Creek, a pillar of the community. Her mouth twisted on the words. I was just the outsider Charles had brought home from back east. Mason frowned. That doesn't explain the bruises. Rebecca's gaze dropped to her cup. After Charles died, Victor took control of everything. The house, the ranch, even our personal belongings. He said it was all part of the inheritance, that Charles had left no will. Her voice faltered. When I protested, when I tried to claim what rightfully belonged to my children, She couldn't continue, but she didn't need to. Mason could fill in the blanks. Why didn't you leave sooner? He asked, careful to keep any hint of accusation from his tone. I had nowhere to go, Rebecca admitted. No family, no money of my own. Victor kept everything under lock and key, and he threatened. Her voice broke. He said if I tried to leave, he'd keep the children, that no court would grant custody to a penniless widow over a successful rancher who could provide for them. Mason felt a surge of rage so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. He forced it down, knowing anger wouldn't help Rebecca now. What changed, he asked when he could trust his voice. Why run now? Rebecca's face hardened. He hit Lily. She said the words clipped and cold. She spilled milk at breakfast, and he struck her so hard she fell against the stove. That night I took what little I could carry, woke the children, and we left. How long ago was that? 5 days, Rebecca said. We traveled mostly at night, stayed off the main roads. I was afraid he'd come after us. And will he? Mason asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Rebecca met his gaze unflinchingly. Yes, she said. Victor doesn't let go of what he considers his. And in his mind, the children and I are his property now. Mason absorbed this, his mind working through the implications. If Rebecca was right, and he had no reason to doubt her, then harboring her put them all at risk. Victor Caldwell didn't sound like a man who would be deterred by a simple refusal. Mrs. Caldwell, he said carefully. Rebecca, I think you should stay here at least for now. Surprise flickered across her face. What? But I've just told you. I heard, Mason interrupted, and that's why you should stay. You're exhausted, the children are weak from hunger, and you've got nowhere specific to go. Here at least you have shelter, food, and someone watching your back. Rebecca stared at him, clearly conflicted. Why would you take such a risk? You don't know us. It was a question Mason had been asking himself all day. The answer when it came to him was simple, yet profound. Because 7 years ago I wasn't there when my family needed me, he said, the words emerging rough and unpracticed. I was helping strangers on the other side of the county when sickness took my wife and son. I couldn't save them, but maybe I can help you. Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. I'm so sorry about your family, she said gently, but this isn't the same. Victor is dangerous. If he finds us here, he won't just take us away. He'll hurt anyone who stands in his way. Let him try, Mason said with a quiet conviction that brooked no argument. I've faced worse than a bully with delusions of grandeur. Rebecca studied him, taking in the set of his jaw, the unwavering resolve in his eyes. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. All right, she agreed. We'll stay, but only until we've regained our strength. Then we'll move on, find somewhere Victor can't reach us. Mason nodded, satisfied with the compromise. Fair enough. As Rebecca rose to return to the barn and her children, she paused, her hand resting lightly on Mason's shoulder. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not just for the shelter, but for believing me. You're the first person who has since Charles died. After she had gone, Mason remained on the porch, staring into the darkness. The night air had cooled, bringing relief from the day's heat, but his thoughts were far from peaceful. He was committing himself to a course that could lead to danger, perhaps even violence. After years of careful isolation, he was inviting complication and conflict back into his life. And yet, as he finally rose and entered his quiet cabin, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time: purpose. For 7 years, he had merely existed, going through the motions of living without truly engaging with life. Now faced with a clear need, a wrong to be righted, he felt a spark rekindling within him. The ember of the man he had once been, a man of action, of conviction, of fierce loyalty, glowed faintly in the ashes of grief. That night, as Mason prepared for bed, he took out the silver pocket watch one last time. Margaret and David gazed up at him from the small photograph, their faces familiar, yet increasingly distant with the passage of time. For the first time since their deaths, Mason found himself wondering not what they would think of his choices, but what they would want for him. I miss you, he whispered to the silent images. I always will, but I think maybe it's time I started living again. With that, he closed the watch and set it on the bedside table. Outside, the vast Montana sky wheeled with stars indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath it. In the barn, a widow and her children slept, their future uncertain, but their present at least secure. And in his cabin, Mason Holloway slept more soundly than he had in years, anchored by a decision that felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely right. Dawn broke over the Montana plains, washing the land in pale gold. Mason rose with the sun, as was his habit, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. But today something felt different. The air seemed fresher, the colors sharper. He caught himself pausing at the window, watching the barn where Rebecca and her children slept, wondering if they were still resting or beginning to stir. It had been 3 days since Rebecca had revealed the truth about her situation, 3 days of cautious adjustment as they established a tentative rhythm to their shared existence. The children remained in the barn, with Rebecca insisting it was more than adequate, despite Mason's offer of the spare room in the cabin. It wouldn't be proper, she'd said, her eyes downcast but her tone firm. Mason didn't press the issue, recognizing her need to maintain boundaries to protect not just her children, but her sense of propriety. Mason had just started the coffee when he heard the barn door creak open. Through the window, he watched Rebecca emerge, her hair neatly braided, wearing one of Margaret's old dresses that Martha Sullivan had altered and sent out from town. The simple blue cotton hung a bit loose on Rebecca's thin frame, but it was clean and whole, unlike her travel-worn garments. She paused in the yard, lifting her face to the morning sun, and for an instant Mason saw something close to peace in her expression. Then Lily burst from the barn, chattering excitedly, and Rebecca's attention shifted to her daughter, her smile warming in a way that made Mason's chest tighten unexpectedly. Samuel followed more slowly, his small shoulders, hunched eyes on the ground. The boy still barely spoke, communicating mostly through nods or head shakes. Mason had tried to engage him, offering to show him the horses or the chickens, but Samuel stayed firmly in his mother's shadow, watching Mason with wary, solemn eyes. Mason stepped onto the porch as they approached. "Morning," he greeted them, nodding toward the cabin. "Coffee's almost ready." "Good morning, Mr. Holloway," Rebecca replied, her formality at odds with the growing ease between them. Lily echoed her mother with a cheerful "Morning, Mr. Holloway," while Samuel merely ducked his head. Inside, Rebecca moved naturally to help with breakfast, cracking eggs into the cast-iron skillet, while Mason sliced bread. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by Lily's occasional questions or observations. The little girl had taken to ranch life with remarkable enthusiasm, fascinated by everything from the chickens to the windmill. "Mr. Holloway," she asked, watching him flip the eggs, "why do you live all alone out here?" Rebecca tensed. "Lily," she admonished softly, "that's not a polite question." Mason shook his head slightly. "It's all right," he said, meeting Lily's curious gaze. "I wasn't always alone. I had a family once." "Unlike us," Lily pressed, undeterred by her mother's warning look. "Something like that," Mason replied, his voice gentle but final. To his relief, Lily seemed to sense she'd reached a boundary and didn't pursue the subject. After breakfast, Mason announced his plans for the day. "Need to repair the chicken coop. Fox got in last week, took 2 hens. He glanced at Rebecca. "Thought I might show Samuel how to collect eggs, if that's all right." Rebecca looked surprised, then grateful. "I think that would be good for him," she said, laying a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Would you like to help Mr. Holloway with the chickens, Samuel?" The boy didn't respond verbally, but he gave a small nod, his eyes flicking briefly to Mason's face before returning to the floor. "I can help too," Lily declared, bouncing in her chair. "Actually," Rebecca said, "I was hoping you might help me today. I noticed Mr. Holloway's garden needs tending, and I thought we might try to salvage some of the vegetables." Mason felt a pang at the mention of the garden, Margaret's garden. He'd neglected it after her death, unable to bear the thought of tending something that had been so completely hers. The most he'd managed was to half-heartedly plant a few essentials each spring: potatoes, beans, carrots, caring for them just enough to ensure a minimal harvest. "Don't have to do that," he said gruffly. Rebecca met his eyes, something like understanding in her gaze. "I'd like to," she said quietly, "if you don't mind." Mason hesitated, then nodded once sharply. "Tools are in the shed," he said, rising from the table. "Samuel, you ready to meet those chickens?" The boy looked to his mother, who smiled encouragingly. "Go on," she urged. "It'll be an adventure." Samuel slid from his chair and moved to stand near Mason, not quite beside him, but close enough to indicate willingness. Mason led the way outside, shortening his stride to accommodate the child's smaller steps. The chicken coop stood a short distance from the barn, a simple structure of wire and wood that had seen better days. Mason knelt beside the door, pointing out the damage to Samuel. "See here, Fox dug under the wire. Need to reinforce it, bury the fence deeper." He pulled a coil of wire from his pocket. "Can you hold this for me?" Samuel took the wire solemnly, watching as Mason began to work. For several minutes, there was only the sound of Mason's tools against the earth and wood. Then, to his surprise, Samuel spoke. "Did the fox eat them?" His voice was so soft Mason almost missed it, a whisper carried on the morning breeze. Mason glanced up, meeting the boy's serious gaze. "Yes," he answered honestly. "That's what foxes do. They hunt to feed themselves and their families." Samuel considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. "But you didn't hurt the fox." "No," Mason said. Just fixing the coop so he can't get in again. Foxes have their place in the world, same as chickens. Same as us. Samuel nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. He continued to hold the wire, passing it to Mason when asked, watching every movement with intense concentration. Gradually, he edged closer until he was kneeling in the dirt beside Mason, small hands tentatively touching the tools, learning their names and purposes. By the time they finished the repair and moved on to collecting eggs, Samuel had spoken more words than in the entire previous 3 days combined. They weren't many simple questions or observations, but each one felt like a victory, a small step towards healing. Across the yard, Rebecca and Lily worked in the overgrown garden, pulling weeds and identifying salvageable plants. Mason caught glimpses of them as he worked Rebecca's bent head, the flash of Lily's blonde hair in the sunlight. The sight stirred something in him, a bittersweet ache that was no longer purely pain. Later, as the afternoon heat built, Mason watched Samuel carefully carry the basket of eggs to the cabin, pride evident in his serious expression. Looking at the boy's thin back, Mason felt a surge of anger toward Victor Caldwell. What kind of man terrorized a child into silence? What kind of monster drove a mother and her children into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs? The same kind a voice whispered in his mind that would kill his own brother for land and money. The thought hardened Mason's resolve. Rebecca and her children were under his protection now, and he would defend them with everything he had. But even as he made this silent promise, Mason couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been growing since his conversation with Nathan. Something was coming. The peaceful interlude they were experiencing was just that, an interlude, a breath before the storm. The days fell into a pattern. Rebecca took over the kitchen garden with an enthusiasm that suggested she found solace in the work. Under her care, the neglected plot began to show signs of recovery. Lily followed her mother like a shadow, chattering constantly, while Samuel gradually emerged from his shell, especially in Mason's presence. The boy seemed drawn to Mason's quiet strength, watching him work with fascinated attention. Mason found himself teaching Samuel small tasks, how to feed the chickens, curry the horses, even whittle simple shapes from soft pine. In return, Samuel began to trust his silence, giving way to questions, his wariness to cautious affection. A week passed, then another. The bruises on Rebecca's back faded from angry purple to sickly yellow. Her face filled out slightly as regular meals restored her health. She insisted on earning her keep, cooking, cleaning, mending Mason's clothes with neat, practiced stitches. In the evening, she read aloud from one of the few books Mason owned, her voice bringing the stories to life in a way that entranced not just the children but Mason as well. He found himself looking forward to these quiet evenings, to the sound of her voice in the lamplit cabin, to Lily's eager questions, and even Samuel's solemn attention. It was as if color and sound had been reintroduced to a world that had existed too long in monochrome silence. But beneath this growing harmony ran an undercurrent of tension. Mason caught Rebecca watching the road, sometimes her body tense, her eyes shadowed with fear. She never ventured into town, preferring to remain hidden at the ranch. And though she never said it aloud, Mason knew she was constantly listening, watching, waiting for Victor Caldwell to appear on the horizon. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived from an unexpected direction. Mason was repairing a saddle on the porch when he heard the distinctive sound of an approaching buggy. Looking up, he recognized Dr. Abigail Montgomery's rig coming up the drive, dust billowing behind the wheels. His first thought was concern: had one of the children fallen ill without his knowledge? But as the buggy drew closer, he saw that Abigail was alone, her expression grave beneath the brim of her practical hat. At 40, Abigail was a handsome woman, her brown hair streaked with silver, her face lined but strong. She had come to Montana as a nurse during the war and stayed, eventually becoming one of the few female physicians in the territory. She visited Mason monthly to check on an old war wound that still troubled him in cold weather. "Mason," she greeted him, pulling the buggy to a halt. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Course not," he replied, setting aside the saddle and moving to help her down. "But you're early. Appointment's not for another week." Abigail accepted his hand, her grip firm and professional. "This isn't an official visit," she said, her voice low. "I needed to speak with you privately." Before Mason could respond, the cabin door opened, and Rebecca appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. She froze at the sight of the visitor, her face instantly guarded. "Dr. Montgomery," Mason said, awkward with the sudden tension. "This is Mrs. Caldwell. She and her children are staying with me for a time." Abigail nodded politely. Mrs. Caldwell, I've heard of your arrival. Rebecca's spine stiffened almost imperceptibly. Have you indeed, she replied, her voice carefully neutral. News travels fast. In a small community, always, Abigail agreed. She turned back to Mason. Might we speak inside? Mason glanced at Rebecca, who nodded stiffly. I'll take the children to gather berries, she said. The bushes near the creek are ripening. She disappeared into the cabin, emerging moments later with Lily and Samuel in tow, a small basket in her hand. We won't be long, she told Mason, her eyes conveying a clear message. Be careful. Once they were out of earshot, Abigail sighed heavily. I see you've become protective of them already, she observed. Mason led her into the cabin, gesturing for her to take a seat at the table. They've had a rough time, he said simply. What's this about Abigail? The doctor removed her hat, placing it carefully on the table. There's talk in town, she began. Reverend Woods has been expressing concerns about the propriety of your arrangement here. Mason snorted. Woods needs to mind his own business. Perhaps, Abigail agreed, but he's not alone. Several of the more traditional families are scandalized by the idea of a widow and her children living under the roof of an unmarried man. They're in the barn, Mason pointed out, irritation edging his voice. And what would these fine, upstanding citizens prefer, that they sleep in ditches? Starve, Abigail raised a placating hand. I'm on your side, Mason. I'm just telling you what's being said. She hesitated, then added, There's more. A man was asking questions in town yesterday about a widow and 2 children traveling alone. Mason felt his muscles tense. What kind of questions? Whether anyone had seen them, where they might have gone. Abigail's eyes were serious. He didn't give his name, but he had money, was offering a reward for information. Victor Caldwell. Mason muttered the name like gravel in his mouth. Abigail raised an eyebrow. You know him? Know of him, Mason corrected. He's Rebecca's brother-in-law, claims she and the children are his responsibility now that his brother's dead. And are they? Mason's jaw tightened. He abused her, threatened the children. She ran to protect them. Abigail absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. I see. That complicates matters. How so, if he has legal guardianship? He doesn't, Mason interrupted. And even if he did, law doesn't give a man the right to beat a woman or terrorize children. Abigail studied him, her gaze penetrating. You've grown attached to them, she observed. Mason didn't answer directly. They deserve better than what they have gotten, he said instead. Yes, they do, Abigail agreed softly. She reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. Be careful, Mason. This man, if he's as dangerous as you say, won't simply walk away. I'm counting on it, Mason replied grimly. Abigail looked troubled by his response. Don't do anything foolish. If there's genuine danger involved, Nathan. That's what sheriffs are for. Mason nodded, though both knew he was unlikely to call for help unless absolutely necessary. He had always handled his own problems. There's one more thing, Abigail said, hesitating. It may be nothing, but Nathan seemed unusually interested in Mrs. Caldwell's situation. He was asking Martha what you'd told her about the family. Mason frowned. Nathan knows something, he said half to himself. He warned me to be careful when I was in town, but wouldn't say why. Be that as it may, Abigail said, rising to leave. Just remember you have friends in town. If you need help, ask for it. She paused, looking around the cabin. It's good to see life returning to this place, Mason. It's been too quiet for too long. After Abigail departed, Mason remained at the table, turning her words over in his mind. The fact that someone was asking about Rebecca in town confirmed his fears. Victor was tracking them. It was only a matter of time before he followed the trail to Mason's ranch. And what then? Mason had no legal right to keep Rebecca and her children if Victor came with proper authority. But the law moves slowly in these parts, and Victor didn't strike him as a man who waited for legal sanctions. No, when he came, it would be to take what he believed was his by force if necessary. Mason's hand drifted to his side where the old war wound occasionally ached. He had been a fighter once, a scout who moved silent as a ghost through enemy territory, a man trained to protect and defend. Those skills had lain dormant for years, buried beneath grief and isolation. But they weren't gone. If Victor Caldwell wanted a fight, Mason would give him one. The sound of laughter drew him to the window. Rebecca and the children were returning their basket full of wild berries. Lily skipped ahead, her face smudged with purple juice, while Samuel walked beside his mother, his small hand in hers. They looked happy, carefree, in a way Mason hadn't seen before. The sight strengthened his resolve. They deserved this peace, this safety, and he would do whatever was necessary to ensure they kept it. That evening, after the children were settled in the barn, Rebecca joined Mason on the porch. The night was clear, stars pricking the vast sky, the air cooling rapidly as it always did after sunset. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the night sounds, crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft whicker of horses in the corral. "Dr. Montgomery seems like a good person," Rebecca said finally, her voice casual but her posture tense. "An old friend." "Known her since the war," Mason replied. "She patched me up once or twice. Keeps an eye on an old injury now." Rebecca nodded, her fingers wearing the edge of her shawl. What did she want today? Mason considered how much to tell her, then decided on complete honesty. "Someone was in town asking about you and the children, offering a reward for information." Rebecca's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her fear. "Victor," she whispered. "Most likely," Mason agreed. "Abigail also mentioned that some folks in town are concerned about your staying here." A bitter smile touched Rebecca's lips. "Of course they are. A widow living under the protection of a bachelor, scandalous." She shook her head. "As if I have so many options." "People talk," Mason said with a shrug. "Makes no difference to me." Rebecca's expression softened. "You're a good man, Mason Holloway. Better than most." She looked out across the darkened landscape. "But I think perhaps we've imposed on your kindness long enough. We should move on before Victor finds us here and brings trouble to your door." "And go where?" Mason asked more sharply than he intended. "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "Somewhere he won't think to look. Somewhere far from here." Mason turned to face her fully. "You can't keep running forever," he said gently. "Sooner or later you'll have to stand and face him." "I know," Rebecca whispered. "But not yet. The children aren't strong enough. I'm not strong enough." Mason fell silent, recognizing the fear behind her words. After a moment he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "Stay," he said simply. "At least until we know what we're dealing with. I've faced worse than Victor Caldwell." Rebecca studied him in the faint moonlight, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you put yourself at risk for us? You barely know us." It was a question Mason had been asking himself with increasing frequency. The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity. "Because you matter," he said quietly. "You and those children. And because I've spent 7 years hiding from life. Maybe it's time I stopped." Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She reached out hesitantly, her hand hovering near his before withdrawing. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." They sat together a while longer, the silence between them comfortable, now filled with unspoken understanding. When Rebecca finally rose to return to the barn, Mason felt a curious reluctance to see her go. "Rebecca," he called softly as she reached the steps. She turned back, her face pale in the moonlight. "Whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." Her smile, though tremulous, was genuine. "Neither are you," she replied. The next day dawned cooler, with clouds building on the western horizon. Mason rose early, as was his habit, and was surprised to find Rebecca already awake, hanging washing on the line behind the cabin. "Storm coming," he observed, nodding toward the distant clouds. Rebecca followed his gaze. "Will it be bad?" "Hard to say. Summer storms can blow over quick, or they can turn mean." Mason gestured toward the wash. "Might want to wait on that. Hate to see your work ruined if the rain comes." Rebecca smiled. "Ever practical, Mr. Holloway." The familiar use of his title, once formal, had taken on a teasing quality that Mason found he enjoyed. "Someone has to be Mrs. Caldwell," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Their easy banter was interrupted by Lily's emergence from the barn, her blonde hair in disarray, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Mama," she called, "Samuel's gone." Rebecca's smile vanished, replaced by instant alarm. "What do you mean gone? He was sleeping right beside you." "He wasn't there when I woke up," Lily explained, anxiety raising her voice. "I looked all around the barn, but I can't find him." Mason moved immediately, his mind shifting to the practiced alertness of his scouting days. "When did you last see him?" he asked Lily. "Last night when we went to sleep," the girl replied, tears threatening. "He was right there." "He can't have gone far," Rebecca said, but her voice betrayed her fear. "Samuel? Samuel, where are you?" Mason laid a steadying hand on her arm. "We'll find him," he assured her. "You check the cabin and outbuildings. I'll search the corral and creek." Rebecca nodded, gathering herself with visible effort. "Lily, stay with me," she instructed, taking her daughter's hand. "Samuel," she called again, her voice carrying across the yard. Mason headed first to the corral, checking behind the water trough and in the small shed where he kept the tack. No sign of the boy. The chicken coop was similarly empty. Worry beginning to gnaw at him, Mason strode toward the creek that bordered the eastern edge of his property. Samuel had shown interest in the water during their walks, watching the minnows dart in the shallows, throwing pebbles to create ripples. If he had wandered off alone, Mason quickened his pace, scanning the ground for small footprints. The earth was dry, making tracks difficult to discern, but as he neared the creek, he spotted a disturbance in the tall grass, a narrow path where someone small had passed. Following the trail, Mason emerged from the brush near a bend in the creek where the water pooled deep enough for swimming. His heart lurched when he saw small boots neatly placed on a flat rock, but there was no sign of Samuel. "Samuel," he called, fear making his voice sharper than intended. "Samuel, answer me." For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence. Then a small voice called back, "Here." Mason followed the sound, rounding a large boulder to find Samuel perched on a fallen log, a crude fishing pole in his hands. The boy looked up, his expression a mixture of surprise and guilt. "I was fishing," he explained, holding up his pole, a stick with a piece of string tied to it. "Like you showed me." Relief washed through Mason, so powerful it left him momentarily speechless. He crouched beside the boy, taking a moment to steady his voice. "You scared us, son," he said finally. "Your mama's worried sick." Samuel's eyes widened. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to scare anyone. I just wanted to catch a fish for breakfast." Mason nodded, understanding the boy's intentions, even as he recognized the danger of a 5-year-old wandering alone near water. "Next time you ask first," he said firmly. "Never go off on your own without telling someone where you're headed. Understand?" Samuel nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir." "Good." Mason held out his hand. "Now let's get back before your mama tears apart the whole ranch looking for you." Samuel hesitated, glancing at his makeshift pole. "But I haven't caught anything yet." Despite his lingering concern, Mason felt a smile tug at his lips. "Tell you what," he said. "Later today, if the storm holds off, we'll come back together. I'll show you how to use a proper fishing line." Samuel's face brightened. "Really, you promise?" "I promise," Mason assured him. "Now let's go find your mama." They walked back hand in hand, Samuel chattering about the big fish he'd seen in the pool. Mason listened, nodding at appropriate intervals, but his mind was on Rebecca. The terror in her eyes when Lily had announced Samuel missing had struck him deeply. It was the look of a woman who had already lost too much, who lived in constant fear of losing more. As they approached the ranch yard, Rebecca came running from the direction of the barn, Lily close behind. "Samuel," she cried, dropping to her knees to gather her son in a fierce embrace. "Where were you? I was so worried." "I went fishing," Samuel explained, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "But I didn't catch anything." Rebecca pulled back to look at him, with relief warring with exasperation on her face. "You can't just wander off like that," she scolded, though there was no real anger in her tone. "You must always tell me where you're going." "That's what Mr. Holloway said," Samuel replied, glancing up at Mason. "He said next time I have to ask first." Rebecca's eyes met Mason's over her son's head, gratitude shining in their depths. "Mr. Holloway is right," she agreed. "And next time you will ask. Promise me." "I promise," Samuel said solemnly. As they walked back to the cabin, Rebecca fell into step beside Mason. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "But you didn't have to," Mason interrupted gently. "He's fine, just curious like any boy his age." Rebecca nodded, though the lingering fear in her eyes told Mason she was thinking of other dangers, other threats. Not just the natural hazards of creek and wilderness, but the human threat that still loomed on their horizon. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. As they reached the porch, the storm moving in faster than Mason had anticipated. They hurried inside Rebecca, quickly gathering the wash from the line, while Mason secured the windows against the coming downpour. By midday, the storm had settled in earnest rain, lashing the cabin, thunder rolling across the plains. Inside, they made the best of their confinement. Rebecca baked bread, filling the cabin with a warm, homey scent that stirred memories Mason had thought long buried. Lily and Samuel played checkers on the floor, their earlier fright forgotten in the simple pleasure of the game. Mason sat at the table repairing a bridle that had needed attention for months. The domestic scene around him felt both strange and familiar, like a half-remembered dream. How long had it been since his cabin had contained anything but solitude? "Your move, Samuel," Lily prompted, breaking into Mason's thoughts. Samuel studied the board with intense concentration, his small brow furrowed. Finally, he moved a piece, looking up at his sister expectantly. "Good move," Lily praised, though Mason could see it had left her king vulnerable. The girl caught his eye and smiled conspiratorially before deliberately making a poor move of her own. Mason felt a sudden tightness in his chest. David had done the same for Samuel's age, letting his younger cousin win at checkers during family visits. The memory, instead of bringing the usual sharp pain, filled him with a bittersweet warmth. Rebecca, kneading dough at the counter, began to hum softly an old folk tune Mason vaguely recognized. Her voice, when she moved from humming to quiet singing, was clear and sweet, rising and falling with the gentle cadence of the rain on the roof. "I haven't heard that song in years," Mason remarked when she finished. Rebecca looked up, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "My mother used to sing it," she said, "on rainy days like this." "It's pretty," Lily said. "Sing another one, Mama." Rebecca obliged, moving from one song to another as she worked. Mason found himself transported to another time, another kitchen, where Margaret had sung as she cooked, her voice blending with the clatter of pots and the laughter of their son. The storm continued through the afternoon and into evening, too fierce for Rebecca and the children to return to the barn. "You'll stay here tonight," Mason decided, looking out at the rain-lashed yard. "I'll take the chair. You and the children can have the bed." Rebecca started to protest, but a particularly violent crash of thunder, which made both children jump, ended her objections. "Thank you," she said instead. "Just for tonight." After a simple supper, they settled in for the evening. Mason built up the fire against the unusual chill brought by the storm, while Rebecca prepared the children for bed. There was an awkward moment when it came time for them to retire. The cabin, designed for a small family, offered little privacy, but they managed with makeshift curtains and careful timing. Mason sat in his chair by the fire long after the others had gone to bed, listening to the storm and the soft breathing of his guests. The rain had slackened somewhat, but still drummed steadily on the roof. Occasionally, lightning illuminated the cabin in brief, stark flashes, followed by the low rumble of distant thunder. He must have dozed, for he woke with a start to the sound of movement. Opening his eyes, he saw Samuel standing beside his chair, his small face pale in the dying firelight. "What is it, son?" Mason asked, straightening. "Can't sleep." Samuel shook his head. "The thunder," he whispered. "It sounds like when Uncle Victor gets angry." Mason felt a surge of protective anger at the comparison. What had this child endured that he associated natural phenomena with human rage? "Come here," he said, patting his knee. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel climbed up, his small body tense. "Thunder is just the sky talking," Mason explained, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the others. "Nothing to be afraid of." "But it's so loud," Samuel protested. "Yes, it is," Mason agreed. "But it can't hurt you. Not here. You're safe." Samuel considered this, his serious eyes studying Mason's face as if searching for deception. "Promise," he asked finally. "I promise," Mason said firmly. "Nothing's going to harm you while I'm around." The boy relaxed slightly, leaning against Mason's chest. "Uncle Victor said Papa's accident was because he made God angry," he confided, his voice barely audible. "He said we made God angry too." Mason's jaw tightened at this revelation. "That's not true," he said, careful to keep his own anger from his voice. "God doesn't work that way. And what happened to your papa wasn't your fault, or your mama's, or yours." "Then whose fault was it?" Samuel asked the question, startlingly direct. Mason hesitated, unsure how much Rebecca had told the children about their father's death. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "bad things happen that nobody can explain. But I promise you it wasn't because God was angry." Samuel nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. He nestled closer, his eyelids growing heavy. I like it here, he murmured drowsily. Can we stay forever? The question caught Mason off guard. That's up to your mama, he said after a moment, but you're welcome as long as she wants to stay. Samuel's only response was a soft sigh as he drifted towards sleep. Mason held him, feeling the slight weight of the child against his chest, listening to his even breathing. The trust implicit in the boy's posture and his willingness to sleep in Mason's arms stirred something deep within him, a protective instinct he had thought died with his own son. Carefully, so as not to wake him, Mason rose and carried Samuel to the bed, where Rebecca and Lily slept soundly. As he laid the boy down, Rebecca stirred, her eyes opening briefly. He was scared of the thunder, Mason explained softly. Rebecca nodded, drawing her son close. Thank you, she whispered, her eyes already closing again. Mason returned to his chair, but sleep eluded him now. Samuel's innocent question echoed in his mind. Can we stay forever? The idea should have alarmed him, 3 people permanently disrupting the solitary existence he had carefully constructed. Instead, he found himself wondering what it would be like to have them here always. To hear Rebecca singing in the kitchen, to teach Samuel to fish and ride, to watch Lily grow into a young woman. To be a family again. The thought both attracted and terrified him. He had built walls around his heart after losing Margaret and David, determined never to be vulnerable to such pain again. But those walls had also kept out joy, companionship, purpose. They had protected him, yes, but at what cost? As the storm gradually moved eastward, its fury spent. Mason came to a realization: he wanted Rebecca and her children to stay. Not just for their safety, but for his own salvation. They had brought life back to his home and perhaps to his heart as well. But there was still Victor Caldwell to contend with. And the unspoken tension between him and Rebecca, the growing awareness of each other that neither had acknowledged aloud, and the practical considerations of what people would say, how they would live, what such an arrangement would mean. No, it wasn't as simple as Samuel's innocent question suggested. Nothing ever was. But for the first time in 7 years, Mason found himself considering a future that wasn't just an endless succession of empty days. The thought carried him finally into sleep, his dreams filled not with the familiar ghosts of loss, but with possibilities he had long ago stopped imagining. Morning broke clear and fresh, the storm having washed the world clean. Mason woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his kitchen, Rebecca preparing breakfast, the children helping in their way. For a moment he lay still, listening to their quiet conversation, the occasional laugh from Lily, even a soft comment from Samuel. It felt right somehow, as if his cabin had been waiting all these years for these voices, this life. Rising, Mason joined them, accepting the cup of coffee Rebecca offered with a nod of thanks. The domesticity of the scene should have felt strange after so many years alone, but instead it seemed natural, as if some missing piece had finally fallen into place. After breakfast, Mason went out to assess any damage from the storm. The yard was muddy, scattered with small branches and debris, but nothing serious. The barn had weathered the tempest well, and the animals seemed unharmed, if a bit skittish. He was checking the chicken coop when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Setting down his tools, Mason moved to the front of the cabin, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle he kept by the door. Sheriff Nathan Blackwood rode into the yard, his expression grave. Behind him, the familiar figure of Abigail Montgomery followed in her buggy. Neither looked as if they brought good news. Mason stepped onto the porch, conscious of Rebecca appearing in the doorway behind him, her body tense with apprehension. Nathan, Mason acknowledged, his eyes moving between the sheriff and the doctor. Abigail, twice in 2 days. Must be important. Nathan dismounted, his movements deliberate. Mason, boy, he greeted, removing his hat. Mrs. Caldwell, we need to talk. The tension in his voice put Mason immediately on alert. What's happened? Nathan glanced at Rebecca, then back to Mason. Victor Caldwell is in Pine Ridge, he said without preamble. Arrived last night. He's claiming his brother's widow and children have been abducted. Rebecca made a small sound of distress behind Mason. That's a lie, she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. We left of our own accord, to escape him. Nathan nodded, his expression sympathetic but troubled. I believe you, ma'am, but Caldwell is convincing. He's got papers, guardianship documents for the children property deeds in his name, and he's got money which talks louder than most things in these parts. What's he planning? Mason asked, though he could guess. He's organizing a search party, Abigail answered, joining them on the porch. telling anyone who'll listen that his poor niece and nephew were taken by their unstable mother. Unstable? Rebecca repeated, indignation flaring. How dare he? It's a common tactic, Abigail explained gently. Discredit the mother to gain custody of the children, especially when there's property or money involved. Mason's jaw tightened. And people believe him. Some do, Nathan admitted. Others are reserving judgment, but he's got enough support to be dangerous. He's offering a substantial reward for information. Martha Sullivan sent us, Abigail added. Someone mentioned seeing a woman and 2 children heading this direction a few weeks back. Martha's stalling, sending them on a false trail, but it won't hold for long. Mason absorbed this, his mind working through the implications. How much time do we have? A day, maybe less, Nathan estimated. Caldwell's determined, and he's got 2 men with him who look like they're used to getting their way. Rebecca had gone pale, her hands clutching the doorframe for support. We have to leave, she said, her voice barely audible. Now before they come. Mason turned to her, his decision already made. No, he said firmly. Running won't solve this. It's time to stand and fight. Fight? Rebecca echoed, fear evident in her eyes. Mason, you don't understand what Victor is capable of. I think I do, Mason replied. He looked back at Nathan. I need to know everything you can tell me about Victor Caldwell. And I mean everything, Nathan. No more holding back. Nathan's expression shifted, a complex mixture of resignation and relief. You're right, he admitted. I haven't been entirely forthright, but it's complicated. Uncomplicated, Mason suggested, his voice deceptively mild. Nathan sighed, exchanging a glance with Abigail. Perhaps we should all sit down, he said. This might take a while. Inside the cabin, with the children sent to play in the yard under Abigail's watchful eye, Nathan removed his badge, placing it on the table before him. The gesture was symbolic, signifying that what he was about to say came not from the sheriff, but from the man. 2 years ago, he began, there was a bank robbery in Silver Creek. 3 men masked took everything in the safe. Shot the teller when he tried to raise the alarm. He lived but barely. Mason frowned, failing to see the connection. What does this have to do with Victor Caldwell? The money was never recovered, Nathan continued. The robbers were never identified. But there were suspicions, rumors that someone local was involved. Someone who suddenly had more cash than his business dealings could explain. Rebecca's eyes widened. Victor, she breathed. After the robbery, he expanded the ranch, bought new breeding stock, built that ridiculous new house. Charles always wondered where the money came from. Nathan nodded. There was an investigation, but nothing could be proven. Then 6 months ago, Charles Caldwell died in what was ruled an accident. It wasn't an accident, Rebecca said flatly. Victor killed him. I'm certain of it. I believe you, Nathan said, surprising her. Because 2 weeks before his death, Charles Caldwell contacted the territorial marshal's office. Said he had information about the bank robbery. Before he could provide details, he was dead. Mason leaned forward, the pieces beginning to fall into place. You think Victor was involved in the robbery, and Charles found out. So Victor killed him to keep him quiet. That's my theory, Nathan confirmed. But without evidence, it's just that, a theory. What does this have to do with Rebecca and the children? Mason pressed. Nathan's gaze shifted to Rebecca. Mrs. Caldwell, did your husband leave any papers, any documents that might connect Victor to the robbery? Rebecca shook her head slowly. Not that I know of. Charles was secretive in the weeks before he died. Worried. He spent hours in his study, but if he found evidence against Victor, he never told me about it. Victor thinks he did, Nathan said, and he thinks you have it. That's why he's so desperate to find you, not just for the children or the property, but because he believes you have something that could send him to prison or the gallows. The revelation hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Victor Caldwell wasn't just a bully seeking control. He was a dangerous man with everything to lose. So what do we do? Mason asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Nathan reclaimed his badge, pinning it back on his vest. Officially, I have no evidence of any wrongdoing by Victor Caldwell. I can't arrest him or prevent him from searching for his missing family members. And unofficially, Mason pressed. A grim smile touched Nathan's lips. Unofficially, I can be slow about organizing that search party. I can make sure certain areas are checked last. and I can make damn sure I'm present when they do find you to prevent any unfortunate incidents. Mason nodded, understanding the limits of what his friend could offer. I appreciate that, Nathan, but I'm not counting on the law to protect Rebecca and her children. That's my job now. Rebecca looked between the two men, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. I won't let Victor take my children, she said firmly. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, I'll protect them. We'll protect them, Mason corrected gently. Together. The conviction in his voice seemed to steady her. She nodded, straightening her shoulders. Together, she agreed. As Nathan and Abigail prepared to leave, the doctor drew Mason aside. Be careful, she murmured, her eyes conveying genuine concern. This isn't just about defending your home. This is about people you have come to care for. Mason didn't deny it. All the more reason to stand my ground, he replied. Abigail smiled sadly. I always knew it would take something momentous to bring you back to the land of the living, she said. I just didn't expect it to be quite so dramatic. After they had gone, Mason found Rebecca on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. The morning sun gilded her hair, highlighting strands of copper among the brown. She looked both fragile and strong, a woman who had endured much but refused to break. We should talk, Mason said, joining her at the railing. Rebecca nodded, her eyes never leaving the children. Yes, we should. She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. I want to thank you, Mason, for everything you have done, for what you are willing to do. But I can't ask you to risk your life for us. You didn't ask, Mason pointed out. I offered. A small smile touched her lips. So you did. She turned to face him fully. Why? And don't tell me it's because we matter. I need to understand why you'd put yourself between us and Victor knowing what he's capable of. Mason considered his answer carefully. How could he explain something he was only beginning to understand himself? The way her presence had awakened parts of him he thought long dead. The way Samuel's trust and Lily's laughter had filled empty spaces in his heart. 7 years ago, he began slowly. I lost everything that mattered to me. My wife, my son, my purpose. I've been existing, not living. Going through the motions. He gazed out across the land, his land seeing it as if for the first time in years. And then you arrived, and suddenly I remembered what it was like to care. To have a reason to get up in the morning beyond just habit. He turned back to her, meeting her eyes directly. I'm helping you because you've already helped me, Rebecca. You and those children. You've reminded me what it means to be alive. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Mason, she whispered his name, a question and an answer all at once. Before he could respond, a shout from the yard drew their attention. Lily was running toward them, her face alight with excitement. Mama, Mr. Holloway, look what Samuel found. The moment broken, they turned to see Samuel approaching more slowly, something clutched carefully in his small hands. He held it up proudly as he reached the porch, a bird's nest fallen from a tree, miraculously intact with 3 tiny blue eggs nestled within. Can we keep it? He asked, his eyes wide with hope. Just until the babies hatch. Mason and Rebecca exchanged a glance, the interrupted conversation still hovering between them. But there was understanding there too, and something more, a connection that transcended words. We'll need to make a safe place for it, Mason said, crouching to examine the nest. Somewhere warm, but not too warm. And we'll have to be very careful not to disturb the eggs. I'll be careful, Samuel promised solemnly. I'll watch over them. And as Mason helped the boy construct a makeshift incubator from a box and soft cloths, he was acutely aware of Rebecca watching them, her expression thoughtful. Later, they would finish their conversation. Later, they would plan for Victor's inevitable arrival. But for now, this simple moment, a man and a boy protecting fragile new life, seemed more important than all the dangers that waited on the horizon. Victor Caldwell was coming, but Mason Holloway was ready. The day after Nathan's warning dawned clear and bright, the storm-washed sky an impossible blue. Mason rose before the sun, moving through the quiet cabin with practiced stealth. Rebecca and the children had spent another night inside, the unspoken understanding being that it was safer to keep them close now that Victor's arrival was imminent. Mason paused by the bed where they slept, his gaze lingering on their peaceful faces. Samuel had curled against his mother's side, one small hand clutching her nightdress. Lily lay on Rebecca's other side, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spilled sunshine. Rebecca herself slept with one arm protectively around each child, even in slumber, maintaining her vigil. The sight stirred something in Mason's chest, a fierce protectiveness mingled with a gentler emotion he wasn't yet ready to name. These three had become important to him in ways he hadn't thought possible. The idea of Victor Caldwell threatening them filled him with a cold anger he hadn't felt since the war. Silently, Mason moved to the window, checking the approach to the cabin, as he had every hour through the night. The road remained empty, the landscape still, but he knew the reprieve was temporary. Victor would come. The only questions were when and with how many men. Mason had spent the previous evening preparing. He'd cleaned and loaded every firearm in his possession, the Winchester rifle, his old Army Colt, even the shotgun that had hung unused above the fireplace since Margaret's death. He'd positioned them strategically around the cabin and outbuildings, ensuring he would have access to a weapon no matter where the confrontation began. He'd also prepared the cabin itself, reinforcing the shutters, stockpiling water-moving furniture to create defensive positions if needed. The preparations were familiar, calling on skills he'd hoped never to use again. Yet there was a clarity to the work, a purpose that energized rather than depleted him. This was what he had been trained for, to protect. And after 7 years of protecting nothing but his own isolation, it felt right to stand in defense of something that mattered. A soft sound behind him drew Mason's attention. Rebecca stood in the bedroom doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger this way, less guarded, though the worry in her eyes aged her beyond her years. "You didn't sleep," she observed quietly. Mason shook his head. "Kept watch." Rebecca moved to join him at the window, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent that clung to her hair. "Any sign?" "Not yet, but he'll come." She nodded, accepting this as inevitable. "What will you do when he does?" Mason considered his answer carefully. "Depends on him," he said finally. "If he comes with the law proper papers, we'll have to fight him that way. If he comes looking for a different kind of fight." He let the sentence hang, its conclusion obvious. Rebecca's hand found his arm, her touch light but insistent. "I won't let you kill for us, Mason." He turned to face her, fully surprised by the fierceness in her voice. "Rebecca." "No," she interrupted. "I've seen enough violence. I won't have more blood shed because of me. Promise me you won't kill Hummer no matter what happens." Mason frowned. "I can't promise that. Not if it comes down to his life or yours, or the children's." Rebecca held his gaze, unwavering. "There's been enough death already," she said softly. "Charles, my parents years ago, you're Margaret and David. Please, Mason, find another way." Something in her plea reached him, penetrating the cold calculation that had guided his preparations. She was right, there had been enough death in both their lives. And what would it do to Samuel and Lily to witness more violence, to know a man had died because of them, even in their defense? "I'll try," he conceded finally. "That's all I can promise. I'll try to find another way." It seemed to be enough. Rebecca's posture relaxed slightly, her hand lingering on his arm a moment longer before withdrawing. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood in silence, watching the sun crest the eastern hills, painting the landscape in gold and amber. It was a moment of strange peace, a breath before the plunge, and Mason found himself storing it away in memory, the quality of the light, the warmth of Rebecca beside him, the soft sounds of the children stirring in the next room. "Mason," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice so low he almost missed it. When this is over, I wanted to say." The distant sound of hoofbeats cut her off, the noise faint but unmistakable. Mason tensed his hand, instinctively moving to the rifle leaning against the wall. "They're coming," he said unnecessarily. "Wake the children. Get them dressed quickly." Rebecca nodded, all vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of determination. "What's the plan?" "You and the children stay inside, away from the windows. I'll meet them out front." Mason checked the rifle's action, satisfying himself that it was ready. "If things go wrong, there's a trap door in the pantry floor. Root cellar below. Hide there until it's safe." "And if it's never safe?" Rebecca asked, the question stark in its practicality. Mason met her eyes steadily. "Nathan knows to check there if I can't." The implication hung between them for a heartbeat before Rebecca nodded, accepting the brutal reality of their situation. She turned toward the bedroom, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Be careful," she said simply. "Always Oh, Mason replied, though both knew how inadequate the reassurance was against the approaching threat. As Rebecca woke the children, Mason moved to the porch, positioning himself where he would have a clear view of the approaching riders while remaining partially shielded by the porch post. The hoofbeats grew louder, resolving into the rhythm of multiple horses moving at a steady trot. Soon they appeared on the horizon, three riders silhouetted against the morning sky. Mason's jaw tightened as he recognized the familiar outline of Nathan's tall frame among them. So Victor had managed to enlist the law after all, or appeared to at least. As the riders drew closer, Mason could make out more details. Nathan rode slightly ahead, his expression grim beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him was a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, Victor Caldwell, matching Rebecca's description. The third rider was younger, harder looking, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. Not Law, then, one of Victor's men. Mason remained motionless as they approached the rifle held ready but not raised. No need to escalate the situation before words were exchanged, but he was under no illusions about how quickly this could turn deadly. The riders pulled up 20 yards from the cabin, dust settling around their horses' hooves. For a long moment, no one spoke, the tension stretching taut between them. Nathan broke the silence first. "Mason," he called, his voice deliberately neutral. "Got some visitors looking for Mrs. Caldwell and her children." Mason inclined his head slightly. "Sheriff," he acknowledged. His eyes shifted to the bearded man. "Mark Caldwell, I presume?" Victor Caldwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. Holloway," he replied, his voice cultured but cold. "I understand you've been harboring my family." "They came seeking shelter," Mason replied evenly. "I provided it." "How charitable," Victor said, the word dripping with disdain. "However, they belong with me. I am their legal guardian since my brother's unfortunate passing." Mason's grip tightened imperceptibly on the rifle. "They don't seem eager to return to your guardianship." Victor's expression hardened. "Children rarely know what's best for them, and Rebecca has been unwell since Charles died. Grief can do terrible things to a woman's mind." "She seemed perfectly sound to me," Itaneo, Mason countered, "especially when she described how you treated her and the children." A flash of anger crossed Victor's face before he controlled it. "Delusions," he said dismissively. "Part of her condition. Sheriff Blackwood can confirm I have the proper documentation. The children are legally in my care." Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "He does have papers, Mason," he admitted, "signed by the judge in Silver Creek." Mason wasn't surprised. A man like Victor would ensure the legalities were covered, especially if he had influence in his hometown. But papers didn't make him right. "Why don't we ask Rebecca what she wants?" Mason suggested, knowing full well what her answer would be. Victor's smile turned predatory. "By all means," he agreed, "though I should warn you she can be quite convincing in her delusions. It's part of her illness." Before Mason could respond, the cabin door opened behind him. Rebecca stepped onto the porch, her head high, her bearing dignified, despite the fear Mason could sense radiating from her. She had dressed carefully in her best dress, her hair neatly pinned as if armor against what was to come. "I'm not delusional, Victor," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "And I'm not going anywhere with you." Victor's false smile vanished. "Rebecca," he said, his tone shifting to one of exaggerated concern, "you've had us worried sick. The children need to come home now." "They are home," Rebecca replied firmly. "Or at least they're somewhere they're safe and cared for, which is more than I can say for your house." Victor's face darkened. "You're not thinking clearly," he insisted. "The journey has confused you. Think of the children. They need stability, their own beds, their own things." "What they need is to be free from fear," Rebecca countered. "To not flinch every time a door slams or hide when they hear heavy footsteps." The younger rider snorted derisively. "Women," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Always hysterical." Nathan shot him a warning glance, but the damage was done. Mason's patience, already stretched thin, snapped at the casual dismissal of Rebecca's legitimate fears. "I think we're done here," he said coldly. "Mrs. Caldwell and her children are staying. You can take your papers and leave." Victor's facade of concern vanished, replaced by open menace. "I don't think you understand the situation, Holloway," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Those children are mine by law. The woman is my responsibility. and you're interfering in family matters that don't concern you. They became my concern when they asked for my help, Mason replied evenly, and when I saw the bruises you left on her. Victor's eyes narrowed. Careful, old man, he warned. You're making accusations you can't back up. I know what I saw, Mason said, and I know what the children told me. Victor's hand moved toward his gun, a movement so subtle it might have been missed by someone less experienced than Mason. But Mason had spent years reading men's intentions in the flicker of a muscle, the shift of weight. His own hand tightened on the rifle. Easy, Nathan interjected, sensing the dangerous current. No need for this to get ugly. He turned to Victor. Mr. Caldwell, I understand your concern for your family, but forcing the issue won't help. Perhaps we could arrange a more neutral meeting. There's nothing to discuss, Victor interrupted. They're coming with me today. Now. His gaze shifted back to Rebecca. Get the children, Rebecca. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Rebecca's chin lifted defiantly. No. The single word hung in the air, its impact far greater than its simplicity would suggest. Victor's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. You don't have a choice, he snapped. Either you come willingly or what? Mason challenged, raising the rifle slightly, not quite aiming it, but making its presence unmistakable. You'll force them over my dead body. Victor's smile returned colder than before. If necessary, he agreed softly. Nathan moved his horse between them, his hand raised placatingly. That's enough, he said sharply. Nobody's dying today. He turned to Victor. I brought you here to talk a Caldwell, not to start a war. If Mrs. Caldwell refuses to go with you, we'll have to take this to the territorial court. And in the meantime, Victor demanded, she keeps my niece and nephew from their home, from their rightful guardian. They stay where they are for now, Nathan said firmly, under my jurisdiction. Victor's face darkened with fury. This is outrageous, he sputtered. I have legal documentation, which will be presented to the court, Nathan interrupted, along with Mrs. Caldwell's claims about your treatment of her and the children. The judge can sort it out. For a moment it seemed Victor might explode with rage. Then abruptly he composed himself, the mask of civility slipping back into place. Very well, he said smoothly. If that's how you want to play this, Sheriff, we'll let the courts decide. The sudden capitulation put Mason on high alert. Men like Victor didn't surrender so easily. He was planning something, some angle Nathan hadn't considered. However, Victor continued, I do have the right to see my niece and nephew, to assure myself they're well. Nathan hesitated, glancing at Mason and Rebecca. That seems reasonable, he said finally. Mrs. Caldwell. Rebecca's hand sought Mason's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. I don't want him near them, she whispered. Mason understood her fear, but he also recognized the precariousness of their position. If they refused such a seemingly reasonable request, it would only strengthen Victor's claim that Rebecca was unstable in keeping the children from their family. It's all right, he murmured. I'll be right here, he won't hurt them. After a long moment, Rebecca nodded reluctantly. Very well, she said loud enough for the riders to hear, but only out here, and only for a moment. She disappeared into the cabin, returning moments later with Lily and Samuel. The children had been dressed in their best clothes, their faces freshly washed, but their fear was evident in the way they pressed against their mother, in Samuel's wide eyes and Lily's trembling hands. Children, Victor called to, his voice suddenly warm and concerned. Are you all right? I've been so worried about you. Lily remained silent, but Samuel shrank back, half hiding behind Rebecca's skirts. The boy's reaction spoke volumes, confirming everything Rebecca had told Mason about Victor's treatment of them. Victor's smile faltered slightly at their response. They seemed frightened. He observed his tone, suggesting this was Rebecca's fault. What have you been telling them, Rebecca? Only the truth, she replied steadily. That you hurt us, that you're not a safe person. Victor's face flushed with anger. Lies, he snapped. All lies. He turned to Nathan. You see what I'm dealing with? She's poisoning them against me, their only family. Nathan's expression remained carefully neutral. The children do seem afraid, he acknowledged, but whether that's because of what they've been told or what they've experienced, I can't say. This is absurd, Victor fumed. I demand you return them to my custody immediately. I have the law on my side. The law also protects children from abuse. Mason interjected quietly, and women from men who beat them. Victor's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing. You're calling me an abuser based on the hysterical claims of a mentally unstable woman. Based on what I've seen with my own eyes, Mason replied evenly. The bruises, the terror these children show at the mere sight of you. Victor's hand moved toward his gun again, more deliberately this time. You're making a very serious accusation, Holloway, one that could get a man killed in these parts. Nathan immediately positioned himself between them again. That's enough, he said firmly. Both of you. This isn't helping anyone, least of all the children. He turned to Victor. You've seen them. They're alive and well. Anything else will have to wait for the court. For a tense moment, Mason thought Victor might defy the sheriff, might draw his weapon despite Nathan's presence. Then with visible effort, he reined in his temper. Fine, he said coldly. We'll do this your way, Sheriff. For now. He fixed Rebecca with a hard stare. But this isn't over. Those children belong with me, and I will have them back. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Rebecca drew the children closer, her face pale but resolute. Victor turned his horse, gesturing for his companion to follow. Come, Jenkins. We have preparations to make. He looked back at Mason, his eyes cold. I'll see you in court, Holloway, if you live that long. With that parting shot, he rode away, Jenkins close behind. Nathan remained watching until they were well down the road, but before turning back to Mason. That went about as well as could be expected, he observed dryly. Mason didn't lower the rifle until the riders were small dots on the horizon. He's not giving up, he said grimly. Court or no court. Nathan nodded, dismounting with a weary sigh. I know. He's planning something. The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through his silver hair. Mason, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said earlier. Mason recognized the gravity in his friend's tone. Inside, he suggested, nodding toward the cabin. Once they were settled at the kitchen table, Rebecca having taken the children to the back room to calm them after Victor's visit, Nathan leaned forward, his voice low. Victor Caldwell isn't just suspected of that bank robbery, he said. I have reason to believe he's killed before. Not just his brother. Mason's eyes narrowed. What kind of reason? The kind I can't prove in court, Nathan admitted, but there have been incidents. Men who crossed him who later had accidents. A witness to the bank robbery who fell from a cliff while hunting. A ranch hand who questioned Victor's treatment of Rebecca, found trampled by his own horse. And no one's connected these deaths to him? Mason asked skeptically. Nathan shrugged. Frontier justice is imperfect at best, and Victor has money influence. People look the other way. He fixed Mason with a serious gaze. What I'm saying is be careful. Court or no court, Victor Caldwell is a dangerous man, and he doesn't like to lose. I'm not planning to let him win, Mason replied evenly. Nathan studied him for a long moment. You've changed, he observed, since they came. Mason didn't deny it. Maybe I remembered who I used to be. A smile touched Nathan's weathered face. Good. That man was worth knowing. He rose, settling his hat back on his head. I'll ride back to town, keep an eye on Caldwell. But Mason, he paused at the door. Watch your back. He won't wait for the court date if he sees another way. After Nathan had gone, Mason found Rebecca in the children's room, sitting on the edge of the bed where Lily and Samuel huddled together. Samuel's face was buried against his sister's shoulder, his small body trembling. Lily looked up as Mason entered, her young face showing a maturity beyond her years. Is he gone? She asked quietly. Mason nodded. Yes. And he won't be back today. Rebecca stroked Samuel's hair, her expression troubled. But he will be back, she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. Eventually, Mason acknowledged, but we'll be ready. He crouched beside the bed, bringing himself to eye level with the children. Samuel, he said gently, look at me, son. Slowly, the boy raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed and fearful. I made you a promise, Mason reminded him. Do you remember what it was? Samuel nodded hesitantly. That I'd be safe, he whispered. That you wouldn't let anyone hurt me. That's right, Mason confirmed. And I meant it. Your uncle can't hurt you here. I won't let him. But he's so angry, Samuel said, his voice barely audible. And when he gets angry, bad things happen. Mason felt a surge of protective fury at what this child had witnessed, what he had been forced to understand at such a young age. I know, he said softly, but I've dealt with angry men before. And I'm not afraid of your uncle. You should be, Lily interjected solemnly. He hurt Papa. I heard him and Papa fighting, and then Papa went away and he never came back. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the suddenly still room. Lily, she said carefully, what do you mean you heard them fighting? When was this? Lily's brow furrowed in concentration. The day before Papa went riding and didn't come home, she said. They were in Papa's study. Uncle Victor was yelling about money and papers. Papa said he knew what Uncle Victor did and he was going to tell. Mason and Rebecca exchanged a significant look over the children's heads. This was the first confirmation of what they had suspected, that Charles had indeed discovered evidence of Victor's crimes and confronted him about it. Did you tell anyone about this, Lily? Mason asked gently. The girl shook her head. Uncle Victor said if we told anyone what we heard in the house, he'd send us away, far away from Mama. So I didn't tell. Her eyes filled with tears. Did I do something wrong? Is that why Papa didn't come home? No, sweetheart, Rebecca said quickly, gathering her daughter close. You did nothing wrong. Nothing that happened to Papa was your fault. Or Samuel's. Mason rose his mind, working through the implications of Lily's revelation. If Charles had confronted Victor about the bank robbery and Victor had killed him to keep him quiet, then the children were in even greater danger than they had realized. They were witnesses even if they didn't fully understand what they had heard. No wonder Victor was so determined to regain custody. Not out of any familial feeling, but to ensure their silence permanently if necessary. The thought chilled Mason to the bone. Victor Caldwell couldn't be allowed to take these children. Not now, not ever. Rebecca, he said quietly, I need to speak with you. She nodded, pressing a kiss to each child's forehead. Stay here, she told them. Rest. Everything will be all right. In the main room, Mason paced, his thoughts racing. This changes things, he said once Rebecca had joined him. If the children heard Victor and Charles arguing about the robbery, they're not just inconvenient to him, they're a threat. Rebecca's face paled. You think he would harm his own niece and nephew? I think he killed his own brother, Mason replied grimly. And Nathan believes he's killed others who stood in his way. The children might not understand what they heard, but Victor can't be sure of that. He can't risk them remembering someday telling the wrong person. Rebecca sank into a chair, the full weight of the danger crushing down on her. What do we do? She whispered. The law won't help us. Not without proof. Mason continued pacing, his military training asserting itself as he assessed their options. We need evidence, he said. Something that connects Victor to the bank robbery or to Charles's death. Something concrete that even a corrupt judge couldn't ignore. But I don't have anything, Rebecca protested. If Charles found evidence, he never showed it to me. Mason stopped suddenly, turning to face her. Are you sure? Think Rebecca. In those last days, did Charles hide anything? Give you anything for safekeeping? Something that might not have seemed important at the time? Rebecca frowned, casting her mind back. No, I don't think. She paused, her expression shifting as a memory surfaced. Wait, the night before he died, Charles gave me his pocket watch. Said it was a family heirloom, that I should keep it safe for Samuel. And did you? Mason pressed. Do you still have it? Rebecca nodded slowly. Yes, it's one of the few things I took when we fled. I couldn't bear to leave it behind. She rose, moving to the small bundle of possessions she had kept with her since arriving at Mason's ranch. From it, she withdrew a worn leather pouch. Inside was a silver pocket watch, tarnished with age, but obviously once fine. Rebecca handed it to Mason, who examined it carefully. It seemed unremarkable, an old watch valuable perhaps for its silver content, but otherwise ordinary. Did Charles say anything else when he gave it to you? Mason asked, turning the watch over in his hands. Anything that might suggest it was important beyond being a family piece? Rebecca shook her head. No, he just... She stopped, her eyes widening. No, that's not true. He did say something odd. He said, remember how I showed you to open it, Rebecca? The trick of it. But there was no trick. It opens normally. Mason's fingers traced the edge of the watch, looking for any hidden catch or compartment. Finding none, he handed it back to Rebecca. Show me how you open it, he suggested. Rebecca took the watch, pressing the small release that opened the face. The watch sprang open, revealing a perfectly ordinary timepiece still ticking after all this time. See nothing unusual. Mason frowned disappointed. There must be something else, he muttered more to himself than to Rebecca. Something we're missing. Rebecca stared down at the open watch, her brow furrowed in concentration. The trick of it, she repeated softly. What trick, Charles? What were you trying to tell me? As if in answer, her fingers slipped, pressing against the back of the watch case. There was a faint click, and a small, previously invisible panel slid open. Rebecca gasped. Mason looked. Inside the hidden compartment was a tightly folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, Rebecca extracted it carefully, unfolding what proved to be a small map. Handwritten notations covered it along with what appeared to be a series of numbers. What is it? Mason asked, peering over her shoulder. I'm not sure, Rebecca replied, studying the markings. It looks like our ranch, but there are areas marked that I don't recognize. And these numbers, she traced a sequence written at the bottom of the map. They could be coordinates or a combination, Mason finished, for her sudden understanding dawning, to a safe or a bank deposit box. Rebecca looked up, hope kindling in her eyes for the first time in days. You think this is what Charles found evidence against Victor? It must be, Mason said. Why else hide it so carefully? The question is, where is the actual evidence, and how do we get to it before Victor realizes what we have? They spent the next hour poring over the map, trying to decipher Charles's notations. The ranch layout was clear enough, but certain areas had been marked with symbols whose meaning eluded them. The series of numbers remained equally mysterious, with nothing to indicate what they might unlock. It has to be somewhere on the ranch, Rebecca said finally, frustration evident in her voice. But Victor controls everything there now. We can't just walk in and start searching. Mason studied the map again, his eyes drawn to a particular marking near what appeared to be an outbuilding. What's this structure? He asked, pointing. Rebecca leaned closer. The old spring house, she said. It's not used much anymore. The new house has modern plumbing, but it was one of Charles's favorite places. He used to go there to think, said it was the one place Victor never bothered him. Mason nodded slowly, an idea forming. A good place to hide something then, he suggested. Something you didn't want your brother to find. Rebecca's eyes widened as she grasped his meaning. You think the evidence is there, hidden in the spring house? It makes sense, Mason said. Isolated, rarely visited, yet not so unusual that Charles's presence there would raise suspicion. He traced the route from the main house to the spring house on the map. How close is it to West's property line? Rebecca considered this. Not far, maybe a quarter-mile from the eastern boundary. Why? Mason's expression turned grim. Because I think one of us needs to go there tonight. Rebecca stared at him, shock written across her face. Go to the ranch, but Victor. We'll be in town, Mason interrupted. Nathan will make sure of it. And we need that evidence, Rebecca. It's the only way to end this, to ensure you and the children are truly safe. But it's too dangerous, Rebecca protested. If you're caught, I won't be, Mason assured her. I was a scout during the war. I know how to move unseen. Rebecca shook her head vehemently. No, I can't let you risk your life for us again. You've done enough, more than enough. This isn't negotiable, Mason said firmly. We need that evidence, and I'm the one best suited to get it. Then I'm coming with you, Rebecca declared, her chin lifting in that stubborn way Mason had come to recognize and admire. Absolutely not, he countered. The children need you here. And they need you too, Rebecca replied. Besides, I know the ranch. I know exactly where the spring house is, how to get there without being seen. You'd be wandering in the dark. Mason wanted to argue further, but he recognized the logic in her words. She did know the property intimately. And time was against them. Victor wouldn't wait long to make his next move. What about the children? He asked his final objection. Rebecca's expression softened. Abigail, she suggested. She could stay with them. I trust her. Mason considered this, weighing the risks against the necessity. Finally, he nodded. All right, he agreed reluctantly. We'll go together, but you follow my lead exactly as I say. No risks, no heroics. Agreed, Rebecca said, relief evident in her voice. When do we leave tonight? Mason decided. After dark. I'll send word to Nathan and Abigail. He met Rebecca's determined gaze. One way or another, this ends tonight. The remainder of the day passed in tense preparation. Mason sent a ranch hand to town with messages for Nathan and Abigail, careful to word them vaguely in case they were intercepted. He checked and rechecked his weapons-packed supplies and studied the map until he could visualize every detail. Rebecca spent the time with the children trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite her own anxiety. She baked bread stories, helped Samuel tend to his bird's nest. If the children sensed her tension, they didn't comment on it, perhaps too relieved at Victor's departure to question their mother's distraction. Abigail arrived as the sun was setting, her buggy loaded with medical supplies. Just in case, she explained grimly when Mason raised an eyebrow at the quantity, I prefer to be prepared. She took Rebecca aside, speaking to her in low tones while Mason finalized his preparations. Whatever she said made Rebecca pale slightly, but she nodded, accepting what appeared to be a small packet from the doctor. Night fell, cloaking the ranch in darkness. The children were put to bed in Mason's room. Abigail settling in a chair nearby, a book in her lap, and a loaded derringer in her pocket. Nothing will happen to them, she assured Rebecca, not while I'm here. Mason and Rebecca slipped out the bonnet door, both dressed in dark clothing, moving like shadows across the moonlit yard. They took Mason's most reliable horse, a steady gelding named Rusty, who moved quietly and wouldn't spook easily. Rebecca rode behind Mason, her arms around his waist, her body warm against his back as they set out towards Silver Creek. The journey took just over 2 hours, Mason keeping to side trails and unused paths to avoid detection. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, the gravity of their mission weighing heavily upon them. As they neared the Caldwell Ranch, Mason reined in, dismounting to secure Rusty in a small copse of trees well away from any traveled road. From here we walk, he whispered, helping Rebecca down. She nodded, pointing east where a faint light glimmered in the distance. That's the main house, she explained softly. The spring house is beyond that rise near the creek. There's a back way through the orchard. The hands never patrol there at night. Mason followed her lead, moving silently through the darkness. Rebecca proved as stealthy as she had claimed, guiding them along overgrown paths and through dense stands of trees, avoiding the more open areas where they might be spotted. The main house loomed in the distance, a large imposing structure with lights still burning in several windows despite the late hour. Mason tensed as they passed it, but Rebecca drew him deeper into the shadows, her hand firm in his. This way, she breathed, indicating a barely visible path that wound around the back of a barn. The orchard is just ahead. They passed through rows of apple trees, their branches heavy with unripe fruit, the air sweet with their scent. Beyond the orchard, a small structure came into view, the spring house built of stone and partially set into the hillside for natural cooling. There, Rebecca whispered, pointing. That's it. Mason surveyed the area carefully, looking for any sign of guards or observers. Finding none, he nodded. Let's go. Quickly, but carefully. They approached the spring house, keeping low and using the natural contours of the land for cover. The door was secured with a simple latch, which Rebecca opened with practiced ease. Inside, it was cool and dark, the sound of running water providing natural cover for any noise they might make. Mason struck a match, illuminating the small space. Stone shelves lined the walls, some holding crocks of butter or cheese, others empty. A natural spring bubbled up from the floor in one corner, channeled into a stone basin before flowing out through a drain. Where would he hide something? Mason asked, keeping his voice low despite the covering sound of the water. Rebecca frowned, examining the familiar space with new eyes. Charles spent hours here, she mused, reading, thinking. He had a favorite spot. Her gaze settled on a stone bench built into the far wall. There, she said suddenly. He always sat there. They moved to the bench, examining it carefully in the flickering matchlight. It appeared solid, immovable part of the spring house itself. But when Rebecca pressed on one end, it shifted slightly. Help me, she whispered, excitement threading her voice. Together they pushed and pulled at the bench until a section moved, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was a metal box locked with a simple combination dial. The numbers, Rebecca breathed, pulling the map from her pocket. With trembling fingers, she turned the dial, following the sequence Charles had recorded. The lock clicked open. Inside were papers, bank records, notes in Charles's handwriting, and what appeared to be a detailed accounting of funds. Rebecca scanned them quickly, her eyes widening. This is it, she whispered, proof that Victor was involved in the bank robbery. Charles tracked the money, showed how Victor laundered it through the ranch accounts. She looked up at Mason, triumph in her eyes. We have him. Mason allowed himself a moment of relief before the practical concerns reasserted themselves. "We need to get this back to Nathan," he said, quickly before it. The sound of a footstep outside the springhouse door cut him off. Mason extinguished the match, instantly plunging them into darkness. He drew Rebecca behind him, one hand reaching for his pistol. The door creaked open, a lantern's glow spilling into the small space. Mason tensed, ready to fight or flee. But it was Nathan who stepped through the doorway, his familiar silhouette unmistakable, even in the dim light. "Mason," he called softly. "Rebecca, are you in here?" "Nathan," Mason responded, relief evident in his voice. "How did you know?" The sheriff raised the lantern, illuminating his grave expression. "I didn't," he admitted, "but Victor figured it out. He's on his way here now with Jenkins and 2 other men. We need to leave immediately." Rebecca clutched the metal box to her chest. "We found it," she told Nathan urgently. "Evidence that Victor was behind the bank robbery. And I think proof that he killed Charles." Nathan's eyes widened. "Show me later," he said. "Right now we need to move. Victor was in a rage when he left town. He means to end this tonight one way or another." They hurried from the spring house, Nathan leading the way. But they had gone barely 20 yards when a shout rang out, followed by the crack of a rifle shot. The bullet whined past Mason's ear, striking a tree trunk beside him. "Run," Nathan ordered, drawing his own weapon. "I'll hold them off." Mason grabbed Rebecca's hand, pulling her toward the orchard. Behind them, more shots rang out, followed by Nathan's return fire. They ran, ducking between trees, heading for the spot where they had left Rusty. They had almost reached the edge of the Caldwell property when a figure loomed out of the darkness ahead of them. Victor Caldwell stood blocking their path, a pistol in his hand, his face contorted with rage in the faint moonlight. "That's far enough," he snarled. "Give me the box, Rebecca." Mason pushed Rebecca behind him, his own gun drawn but not yet raised. "It's over, Caldwell," he said evenly. "We have proof of what you did. The bank robbery, your brother's murder." Victor's laugh was harsh, humorless. "Proof who's going to see it? You'll both be dead before morning. Tragic accident. Trespassers shot by mistake." "Nathan knows we're here," Mason countered. "He'll be looking for us." "Blackwood," Victor sneered. "He's probably dead already. Jenkins is a good shot." The casual brutality of the statement confirmed everything Mason had suspected about Victor Caldwell. This was a man without conscience, without limits. A man who would kill his own brother, who would murder a sheriff, who would orphan his niece and nephew without a second thought. "You won't get away with this," Rebecca said from behind Mason, her voice steady despite her fear. "Even if you kill us, there are others who know. The children? The children will be dealt with," Victor cut in coldly. "Tragic accidents happen all the time on ranches. And then, well, the Caldwell fortune will pass to its rightful heir. Me." Mason felt Rebecca's hand tighten on his arm, felt her fear and anger as if they were his own. In that moment, he knew he would do whatever was necessary to protect her, to ensure she and her children survived this night. "You'll have to kill me first," he said quietly. Victor's smile was chilling. "With pleasure, old man." His gun came up fast, but Mason was faster, diving sideways and pulling Rebecca down with him as Victor's shot rang out. They rolled behind the cover of a large tree as Victor fired again, the bullet splintering bark inches from Mason's head. "Stay down," Mason ordered Rebecca, returning fire. His shot went wide in the darkness, but it forced Victor to seek his own cover. "You can't win this, Holloway," Victor called, his voice mocking. "Even if you somehow get past me, Jenkins will be here any minute. You're outnumbered, outgunned." Mason didn't bother to respond, conserving his breath and his concentration. He had been in worse situations during the war, had faced longer odds. The key was to stay calm, to think clearly, while your opponent gave in to emotion. And Victor Caldwell was nothing if not emotional, now his careful facade stripped away to reveal the raging core beneath. He fired again, the shot wild, betraying his position among the trees to Mason's experienced eye. Mason aimed carefully, squeezing the trigger. Victor's cry of pain told him the bullet had found its mark, though not fatally. Good. Mason wanted him alive, wanted him to face justice for his crimes. But Victor wasn't finished. Wounded but still dangerous, he charged from his hiding place, firing as he came. Mason shoved Rebecca further behind the tree and rose to meet the threat, his own gun ready. The two men collided in a brutal tackle, Mason's superior weight bearing Victor to the ground. The impact knocked Victor's gun from his hand, sending it skittering into the underbrush. But Victor fought like a cornered animal, striking out with fists, knees, teeth, anything to inflict damage. Mason felt a blow connect with his jaw, tasted blood in his mouth. He returned the hit, his fist driving into Victor's side where the bullet had grazed him. Victor howled in pain, but didn't relent, scrabbling for a knife at his belt. The blade flashed in the moonlight, arcing toward Mason's throat. He caught Victor's wrist, the two men locked in a deadly struggle, the knife trembling between them as each fought for control. Slowly, inexorably, Mason forced the blade away, his greater strength beginning to tell. Victor's face contorted with effort, in rage, spittle flying as he cursed. "I'll kill you," he panted. "I'll kill her. I'll kill those brats. I'll burn your ranch to the ground." Mason said nothing, focusing all his energy on the fight. The knife edged closer to Victor's chest, inch by painful inch. Victor's eyes widened as he realized he was losing, that his own blade was turning against him. With a final desperate surge, he twisted, trying to break Mason's grip. The movement backfired, the knife plunging into Victor's shoulder instead of his chest. He screamed, the sound raw and animal-like in the quiet night. Mason pulled the knife free, tossing it aside, and rolled Victor onto his stomach, pinning him with a knee in the small of his back. The fight gone out of him, Victor lay panting in the dirt, blood seeping from his wounds. "It's over, Caldwell," Mason said, breathing hard. "You've lost." The sound of approaching footsteps made Mason tense his hand, reaching for the gun he had dropped during the struggle. But it was Nathan who emerged from the trees, his own weapon trained on Victor's prone form. "Took you long enough," Mason observed dryly. Nathan smiled grimly. "Had to deal with Jenkins. He won't be troubling anyone again." He surveyed the scene, taking in Victor's subdued state and the metal box clutched in Rebecca's hands. "I take it you found what you were looking for." Rebecca nodded, rising shakily from her hiding place. "Everything," she confirmed. "Bank records, notes Charles made about his suspicions. It's all here." Nathan nodded in satisfaction. "Then Victor Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Charles Caldwell, for involvement in the Silver Creek bank robbery, and for attempted murder of a law officer." He knelt, securing Victor's hands behind his back with a pair of handcuffs. "You have a date with the territorial judge, and I don't think you're going to like the outcome." Victor glared up at them, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat. "I have friends, connections. You think a backwater sheriff and a washed-up old scout can bring me down? You're fools, all of you." Nathan hauled him to his feet, unmoved by the threats. "Save it for the judge," he advised. "You'll have plenty of time to practice your speech while you're waiting for the hangman." As Nathan led Victor away, Rebecca moved to Mason's side, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason squeezed her hand gently. "Yes," he said, "it's over. He can't hurt you or the children anymore." Rebecca's shoulders sagged with relief, 7 months of fear and tension finally releasing their hold. Mason slipped an arm around her, supporting her as the last of her strength seemed to ebb away. "Let's go home," he said softly. Home. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Not just a place, but a promise. A future. Together they made their way back through the orchard, following Nathan and his prisoner toward where they had left their horses. The night was quiet now, the earlier violence receding like a bad dream in the face of dawn. As they rode back toward Mason's ranch, Rebecca leaning against his back, her arms around his waist, Mason found himself thinking not of the danger they had faced, but of what awaited them. The children, safe and whole, the life they might build together, free from the shadow of Victor Caldwell. It wouldn't be easy. There would be legal matters to settle, wounds both physical and emotional to heal. But for the first time in 7 years, Mason looked toward the future with something like hope. The sun was just cresting the eastern hills as they approached the ranch, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Abigail stood on the porch relief, washing over her face as she spotted them. Beside her, 2 small figures waited, Lily and Samuel, still in their night clothes, bouncing with impatience. As Mason helped Rebecca dismount, the children ran to her, flinging themselves into her arms with cries of joy. She knelt in the dust of the yard, gathering them close, tears streaming unashamedly down her face. "Is the bad man gone, Mama?" Samuel asked, his voice small but steady. Rebecca looked up at Mason, then back to her son. "Yes, sweetheart," she assured him. He's gone for good. We're safe now. Lily, perceptive as always, looked between her mother and Mason. Does that mean we can stay? She asked. Here with Mr. Holloway. Rebecca hesitated, her eyes finding Mason's, the question in them clear. It was the moment of truth, the decision that would shape all their futures. Mason crouched beside them, bringing himself to the children's level. I'd like that very much, he said softly, if your mama agrees. Three pairs of eyes turned to Rebecca, hope shining in them like the morning sun. She smiled, the expression transforming her tired face, making her beautiful, despite the dust of travel and the strain of the night's events. I think, she said carefully, that would make us all very happy. Mason felt something shift within him, a weight lifting that he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there. The grief for Margaret and David would never entirely leave him, nor should it. But alongside it now was something new, something hopeful. A second chance at happiness, at family, at life. As they walked toward the cabin, the children chattering excitedly, Rebecca's hand found Mason's again. Their fingers intertwined, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. Mason squeezed her hand gently. No, he replied. Thank you for bringing me back to life. The silver pocket watch that had started their adventure rested in Rebecca's pocket, its secret now revealed, its purpose fulfilled. But Mason's own watch, the one containing the images of his lost family, remained in its place beside his bed. He would keep it there not as a shrine to the past, but as a reminder. A reminder that love once experienced never truly dies. That grief given time and space to heal can make room for new joy. That wounds, even the deepest ones, can mend. And as they stepped onto the porch of what was now truly home, Mason knew that the healing had already begun.